While most of Disney's direct-to-video sequels are generally considered to be terrible, some of them do have their defenders, with one of the more notable ones being Aladdin and the King of Thieves, partially thanks to Robin Williams actually returning to voice the genie once again. But that being said, Aladdin's first direct-to-video sequel, that being Aladdin: The Return of Jafar, isn't actually all that bad when you really stop and look at it, and it's mostly due to everything that was stacked against it that's caused many to lump it in with Disney's worst direct-to-video sequels. And today, while trying to stay as impartial as possible, I'd like to take a look at The Return of Jafar and see if it deserves a bit more recognition than it ultimately gets. And quite obviously there will be spoilers ahead, so in case you've never seen this movie and don't want to know how it ends, please feel free to click off the video. You have been warned. Okay, so let me just clarify here that I'm not trying to argue that Aladdin: The Return of Jafar is secretly an unsung masterpiece or something, because as I already explained in my video on Disney's direct-to-video sequels, which you can find a link in the description to, it's debatable if any of those films were actually good from an objective standpoint. So no matter what, something like The Return of Jafar is simply slightly above mediocre at best. Instead, I'm just trying to argue here that the movie isn't quite as bad as its general reputation makes it out to be, especially when compared to the worst direct-to-video sequels that Disney has to offer. And the biggest reason for this mainly comes down to the fact that it doesn't make any of the mistakes that most of their later sequels would. Because among other things, it doesn't just rehash the plot of the original Aladdin all over again, doesn't continue a completely finished story by pulling a conflict out of thin air, and doesn't tear down the main characters in order for them to learn a lesson that they already had or didn't need to learn in the first place. Because what most are apt to forget is, even though it was obviously unintentional, the original Aladdin arguably ended with a sequel hook by leaving the audience to wonder what would happen if Jafar escaped from his lamp now that he was an all-powerful genie, and the movie smartly uses that as its premise. In other words, unlike something like Cinderella 2, Dreams Come True, The Hunchback of Notre Dame 2, or The Little Mermaid 2, Return to the Sea, which had no business existing in the first place since their stories had been totally wrapped up, The Return of Jafar at least justifies its own existence by continuing the story with a plot thread that was plausibly left over from the original film, rather than just pulling some random conflict out of a hat just to continue the story. It arguably has a reason for existing, even if most would concede that it didn't have to be made and that the first Aladdin still works just fine without it. But even more than that, it also justifies how Jafar manages to escape his imprisonment based off what's shown in the original, because Aladdin explains that only a genie is bound to its lamp and is therefore a slave to it. But at the end of the movie, Jafar drags Iago into the lamp with him, thus imprisoning them both. But because Iago isn't a genie and was instead just pulled inside, it makes sense that he might be able to get out of it on his own and Jafar out of the Cave of Wonders with him, which is exactly what ends up happening. In other words, Jafar couldn't get out of the lamp on his own. That is concrete fact. But because he had somebody in the lamp with him who wasn't bound to it, it wasn't out of the realm of possibility that Iago could escape without outside help, and therefore free Jafar in the process. So this already gives The Return of Jafar a leg up over most Disney direct-to-video sequels, because not only does it have a reason for existing, but respects what was established in the original and works within its confines rather than just ignores them. But perhaps the best thing this movie does right, apart from not just retelling Aladdin all over again and actually having a different story, that is not focusing on the character of Aladdin and instead shifting the focus to the only other character left that had the potential to carry his own story, Iago. And honestly, given how popular he was in the original, along with Gilbert Gottfried's willingness to reprise his role, having him take center stage and joining the good guys was honestly the smartest thing they could have done, both because it made for the best story with what they had to work with, and because it gave the audience more of a fan favorite character. And it should really say something that out of everything most Disney direct-to-video sequels did that people just ignore, Iago becoming a good guy is one of the only things that's actively embraced by fans and something that even casual people tend to know about. But even more than that, it allows both Aladdin and the genie to have roles in the movie without what they learned in the previous film being reversed, as this is about Iago's redemption and allows the characters as they were in the original to remain intact, unlike certain later direct-to-video sequels which tore down the characters simply to try and rebuild them all over again, and usually badly at that. And this is particularly notable because even those who hate the movie will usually concede that if there's one thing that's done right about it, it's Iago. Because somewhat impressively, his going from the unapologetically evil henchman of the psychopathic Jafar to a parrot plagued by guilt to such a degree that he kills his former master is actually done halfway believably. Particularly because it's easy to assume that his having to bear the brunt of Jafar's abuse while stuck in the lamp for who knows how long could not have been fun for him, and Jafar's ingratitude was just the final straw. So he decides to venture out on his own and take advantage of the good guys to get back to where he was before, only to find himself appreciating that they're actually nice to him. But then Jafar returns, and by this point he realizes that he'd much rather work for people who treat him with respect and above all would never try to kill or hurt him, causing him to eventually grow a backbone and save his new friends from an almost unstoppable force, because his betrayal was the one thing Jafar did not see coming. But Iago didn't save the day at the end of the movie by killing Jafar like most people think. Oh no. Instead, he did that in his very first scene by not releasing Jafar and abandoning him. Because think about it. If Iago had just rubbed the lamp and wished Jafar free, nobody would have ever been able to stop him. But instead he left him at the mercy of a man who had no loyalty to him, thus leaving him tied to the lamp long enough to kill him with it. And Jafar himself is honestly another thing about this movie that's done pretty well, as he not only proves to be very smart and has the perfect motivation in revenge, but his newfound skills as a genie are put to surprisingly good use, to the point that some would argue that the movie lives up to his threat level quite well, especially in that it's totally understandable why Iago is left terrified of him and doing what he says out of fear, because he's literally become the most powerful being alive and is not afraid to use that power. And because of that, the final confrontation with him is also rather notable, as it's about as believable as a climax with a villain who can't kill but is trying to get around that could be. Though a lot of the credit also belongs to Jonathan Freeman's performance, as he not only hasn't missed a beat since the original, but perfectly brings a much more vicious and raw Jafar to life, making him perhaps the standard for what an evil genie should be like. Heck, the whole cast honestly deserves credit here, because even if the writing isn't quite up to snuff, they sure sell it with everything they've got, though Gilbert Gottfried has to be another one of note. Seriously, for anybody who still believes that all he could be was loud and obnoxious, this movie proves them dead wrong, as his emotional range for Iago, and especially his fear and guilt, show that he was most definitely a capable actor when the situation called for it. But as I noted at the beginning, all of this isn't to argue that the movie is secretly a work of art that's been overlooked, simply that it's not the piece of trash that some label it as, because it definitely has its shortcomings, don't get me wrong, with the most obvious being that the writing isn't anywhere near as good as the original. It may have its good points, as I just got through saying, but it does have plenty of weaker moments and aspects to it. Though apart from that, the two biggest things working against it are easily Robin Williams not reprising his role as the genie, since as I pointed out in another video, which you can also find a link in the description to, some people are just born for a specific role and can't be replaced, even if Dan Castellaneta definitely tries his best, and also the terrible animation. Seriously, if the animation quality had been better, that alone might have made it seem better, because especially when compared to the original, some of this stuff is downright pathetic. Some scenes on their own aren't so bad, but others? But the point is, while The Return of Jafar may have its fair share of problems, it's nowhere near as bad as Disney's worst direct-to-video sequels, and actually gets quite a few things right that later such films would get dead wrong, proving that when all is said and done, the best way to describe it would be that it's simply average, rather than definitively good or bad either way. Alright, that's everything I had to say on that. So now let me hear from you. Do you believe that Aladdin: The Return of Jafar is slightly better than most people give it credit for? Or do you believe that it's easily one of the worst direct-to-video sequels Disney ever made? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. Because you do not have to agree with any opinions expressed in this video if you don't want to. You can feel about this or any other topic we discuss here however you'd like, and if you think I had it all wrong, that is totally fine. And thank you all for watching. It is very appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.